So, what was the first Octavia Butler book that you read, and were you instantly hooked, or did it take some time? I know you were exposed to Octavia Butler at a young age through your mother, as you
Right.
write about in towards the end of the book. But what was your first actual reading?
The first book I read was Kindred. And I have always been a time travel person. I've always been interested, like that's usually been my way into speculative fiction is shifts in time. It's this sort of brain shifts, like dreams in time. And because it also was rooted in history, the Dana, the protagonist who's going back and forth between contemporary Pasadena and antebellum Maryland and, being a slave, like that was fascinating to me. And so that really that hooked me. I thought, what an interesting way to tell a story. Even as a young person, I was thinking about all of our unfinished business.
So much of Octavia Butler's inspiration came from walking around, riding buses, going to the library. One of my favorite sentences you write is, books, borrowed, broken, battered, have always led by example. Can you talk a little bit about Octavia Butler's relationship with libraries?
Oh, absolutely. She called a library as her palace, her second home. It was her way of being able to expose herself to books. Her mother took her when she was little, and she just kept up the habit through most of her life. But as a child, there's the Pasadena Library, the Central Library, the big one. There's the children's room is called the Peter Pan room. And at a very early age, Octavia read her way through the entire Peter Pan room and could not go into the adult section until she was 14. So, but she says she would not have been who she was without that library, without being able to absorb all those books. It made her a book lover for life. It was also her passageway out of a small world she was in, in her personal life, and to be able to dream bigger by going all these different places in books.
What do you see as the most significant differences between Estelle and Octavia?
Mm. I love that you picked up on that. And I think we all feel this way in a little way, especially as we are trying to figure out who we are. Young Estelle, which is Estelle is Octavia's middle name, and she was called Estelle in her family. When she made a decision that she wanted to have a more public kind of life and have the courage that she needed to gather to do that, she decided that part of her as a writer, she was constructing stories, but she had to start constructing herself. And so Octavia became a character that could have the courage. And I love this one detail about Estelle, Estelle, who's timid and introverted, shy, retreating, would not wear makeup, would not wear high heels, would not, all these different things, would not wear earrings, would all these, but Octavia would. So she had to construct a character for herself in order to be in the world. And that's what she began to do, in her head first and on the page first.
Octavia Butler was a deeply compulsive person, compelled to write fiction, but also compelled to do things like make endless lists. My father was a deeply compulsive person and the most sort of neurotic list maker I've ever known. Some of this he passed down to me. And I was wondering, do you personally relate to her compulsions?
Mm. You're the first person to ask me that question. And not quite the list making parts of it, but there was something very familiar. I mean, I'm going to step back just to say part of this process of being in an archive like hers, which is so large and so deeply sensitively personal, often I felt I was literally in her head, and so sometimes when I would be reading something, just the way she would, for example, edit, her manuscripts and the amount of time she would go through them before that I could relate to. I was like, oh, I see what she's doing now. I see what she's doing now. I see what she's doing now. And the other piece that I think I've picked up on, and it may end up being a new compulsion, for me, is this idea of, I'm not a big journaler, like she was, but this idea of every day writing down the things that trip you up, that tie you up in knots, that make you really do stop you from moving forward. And she very compulsively sat down and forced herself, let me untie this knot here before I try to go forward in my life, my day-to-day life and my writing life. And that was something I thought that would be so helpful, instead of, holding on to it and again, compulsively turning it over in my brain, put it on the page and let go of it, So yeah, absolutely that. But I love those lists, and I love the marginalia, and getting to see how her mind was working during the day and what she needed to hop on and what made her feel accomplished.
You quote Octavia Butler as writing the following about her childhood. Quote, "We were lucky enough not to be able to afford a television at the time, so I read everything I could find," unquote. And yet, one of her life dreams was to be free and clear, including free of debt, and to be comfortable and worry-free. Is there a contradiction there?
That's a really good point. Yes, because to be free and clear meant she needed to have the money, to do it. And that would involve her in, she'd be in the gears of capitalism and all of that. I think so much of what she was trying to do is try to figure out a way to make it as a writer, and then once again write her own ticket to how she wanted to live that life. So she could some way get that money bag and open up space, because she was also interested in, and this is stuff that's really tender for me in the archive, because she deprived herself from so much. She wanted to give to kids, so she wanted to set up libraries and writing programs, and she thought, maybe I can buy a house and set up a writing program for young people. She was thinking ahead about how to see her life outside of commerce, and the books would hopefully pave the way for things, but she wanted to do something outside of that structure.
Another thing that you quote her as writing is, "Normal was what I was trying to escape. It was boring me out of my mind." I found that quote to be totally exhilarating. And I'm wondering if you personally relate to that quote, and if so, what does normal mean to you?
I have friends who tease me because as soon as they say the word normal, and this has been going on for decades now, how are you defining normal? Normal, what is normal? That's always been an issue for me as a writer, as we, see, especially working as a journalist, is when, what is understood when you're writing in a newspaper, what is the baseline? What is the normal? What are we writing? Who are we writing to? Who are we writing against? All of that has always really irked me since I was young. So yeah, I totally understood what she was saying. And this idea of, I live in her, by chance, I live in her old neighborhood. So I can relate to what she was seeing when she was growing up, about this people aspiring to having, identical looking lawns and identical looking houses and identical looking this. And no, there was no space for her in that normal. And she really fought for space for herself in so many ways. And I think about that too. And I've spoken a little bit about this recently because it keeps coming up, that as a journalist too, I think, me deciding to go into writing news, stories or feature stories, was about kind of moving the walls out and lifting the ceiling a little bit. So making space for other realities that exist. You know, normal is a word we don't have a use for.
One of the things that's so amazing about Octavia Butler is some people are scared to read her because it's called science fiction. But it's like, just ignore if those words scare you, ignore them and just read, because this is and I also, as I learned, actually, you know, Octavia Butler, I guess maybe for you too, was like a gateway for me into science fiction, because it wasn't until I read Octavia Butler that I understood that science fiction is about humanity. Right. It's not about outer space. It's about a handful of Earth, and you know, and
exactly. And that's just it. And you're so right. It's like, she says, people want to put this tag on what I do. But she said, you know, Kindred, for example, there's no science in Kindred. There's no big machine that's taking Dana back and forth in time. You know, that's your brain doing it. And I'm taking you through, and it's a way for me to show you that, okay, if it's science fiction, history can be a planet. And I'm now going to populate history, and I'm going to take you there. And I loved that. I mean, that kind of my brain just went poof, you know, like when he said that, it's like, that's absolutely right. You know, there's nothing in this that we could relate. It's about love. It's about possession. It's about fracture. It's, you know, it's about hierarchies, and, you know, so it's about our lives.